They were 74 and 70, with no savings left and a single blanket between them, sleeping beside paint cans in their son's unused storeroom, when a thin envelope arrived bearing news that made no sense at all. A remote cabin, left to them by a relative they'd shared only 2 quiet afternoons with decades ago. Their children scoffed, waved it off as a rotting hut, told them to sign it over before embarrassing themselves, before becoming even more of a burden. But when Eleanor and Samuel Carter unlocked that cabin door weeks later, when the cold air settled and a loose stone beneath the hearth shifted, they uncovered something sealed away for a lifetime, something carefully hidden, something worth more than anyone who mocked them could imagine. And in that moment, everything their family thought they were entitled to slipped permanently out of reach. Stay with this story. Don't skip. The piece that explains everything comes later, and it changes how you see every moment. The hum of the welfare office lights pulsed overhead, sharp and unforgiving. Eleanor sat rigid in a molded chair, her hands folded the way they used to be at dinner, knuckles pale, wedding ring worn thin. Samuel stood instead of sitting, leaning on his cane, eyes fixed on a cracked tile as if it might offer answers. Around them, paperwork shuffled, numbers were called, and dignity quietly waited its turn. Can you feel that pause right before hope either arrives or disappears? The room smelled faintly of dust and old paint, the kind of smell that settles into places meant for storage, not living. Cardboard boxes were stacked along one wall, their labels half faded, filled with things Eleanor and Samuel hadn't touched since they were told this move would only be for a little while. A borrowed lamp hummed softly in the corner, casting a weak yellow circle that didn't quite reach the ceiling. Outside the thin door, footsteps passed and disappeared, never stopping. Samuel folded the blanket more neatly, even though it wouldn't change how little space they had. Eleanor noticed, the way she always did, and placed her hand over his for just a second. No words. They'd learned a long time ago how to speak without them. From the other side of the door, a child's voice drifted in, sharp, careless, unfiltered. "Mom says don't touch their stuff." The words landed heavier than they should have. Eleanor closed her eyes, just briefly, not because the comment was cruel, but because it was honest. That was the part that hurt. Have you ever trusted someone so completely you didn't see the fall coming? They didn't talk about how they got here. Not tonight. They focused instead on small tasks, straightening the blanket, lining up their shoes, wiping down a folding table that had become their dresser, kitchen, and desk all in one. Samuel adjusted the photo frame they'd carried with them everywhere, a faded picture of the two of them standing in front of their old house, shoulders touching, smiles unforced. Can you feel how quiet this moment is? Years earlier, mornings began with routine and purpose. Samuel's hands used to smell like engine oil and soap, the honest scent of work done right. Eleanor's shoes had worn thin from long shifts, moving from room to room, caring for people who needed help standing, eating, breathing. They'd never been rich, never chased anything flashy. Bills were paid, meals were shared, children were raised with patience, even when patience ran out. Now, time stretched differently. It lingered in the pauses, in the space between footsteps, in the way Eleanor counted breaths when the house grew too still. Samuel cleared his throat. "You cold?" She shook her head, though she was. He tucked the blanket closer anyway, his movements slow, careful. His hand trembled just slightly, not enough to mention, but enough for her to notice. She always noticed. Where do you think they believed safety still existed? Because once, safety had been a kitchen table. It had been homework spread out under warm lights, It had been scraped knees kissed better, and promises that tomorrow would be easier. When Samuel got sick, when things began to slip sideways, they believed family was where you landed when your legs gave out. They'd sold what they were told to sell, signed what they were told to sign, trusted the reassurances that came wrapped in familiar voices. "We'll handle it. Don't worry. This is just temporary." Eleanor stared at the door again, listening. Laughter floated faintly from somewhere deeper in the house. A television clicked on. Life continued, just not including them. She leaned her head against Samuel's shoulder. He didn't move away. He never did. "You remember the garden?" she asked quietly. He smiled. The real kind, small but genuine. "Tomatoes always grew crooked, but they tasted right," she said. He nodded. That was how most things in their life had been. A little worn, a little uneven, but honest. Somewhere inside Eleanor, a question formed that she didn't yet have the courage to ask out loud. Not about money, not about blame, but about how love could thin so quietly that one day you realized you were standing in a room never meant for you, holding on to dignity like it was the last box you hadn't been asked to unpack. And as the light flickered once and steadied, the story listened back to them, waiting for what they didn't yet know was already on its way. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, slipped through the narrow mail slot with a dull, final sound. It landed on the concrete floor beside their shoes, heavier than most letters, cream-colored, edges crisp, their names printed with a formality that felt out of place here. Eleanor stared at it for a long moment before bending down to pick it up, as if sudden movement might make it disappear. There was no rush, no excitement, just a quiet caution shaped by years of learning that official envelopes rarely carried good news. Samuel turned it over in his hands. No return address they recognized, just a seal, embossed, deliberate. He felt the old reflex rise in his chest, the one that braced for rejection, denial, another reminder of limits. He slid a finger under the flap anyway. Inside was a letter folded once, clean and precise. The language was formal, careful, almost old-fashioned. It informed them, without flourish, that they had been named the sole beneficiaries of a property belonging to a relative who had passed away months earlier, a man whose name they both recognized only after reading it twice, Elias Rowan Hale. Eleanor frowned slightly. "We met him once?" she said. "Twice," Samuel corrected gently. "At your aunt's funeral, and that Christmas after." The memories came back slowly, like figures emerging from fog. A quiet man, polite, more observer than speaker. He'd sat near the window, hands folded, listening more than talking. They remembered him asking how Samuel's work was going, complimenting Eleanor's patience with the children. Nothing remarkable, nothing that explained this. The letter continued, a remote property, modest dwelling, land included, no conditions, travel expenses already arranged should they choose to visit. Eleanor let the paper rest in her lap. Her first instinct wasn't joy, it was suspicion, not of the man, but of the world. Gifts, she'd learned, usually arrived with strings, even when they pretended not to. "Why us?" she whispered. Why would someone they barely knew trust them this much? They sat with the question instead of answering it. Samuel folded the letter carefully, aligning the edges with the same precision he'd used his whole life. "Maybe it's a mistake," he said, though there was no real conviction behind it. Later that evening, the conversation found its way beyond the garage. It always did. Their daughter leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed loosely, concern painted carefully over calculation. "A property?" she repeated. "Out where?" When Eleanor told her, the response came too quickly. A laugh, light and dismissive. That's basically nothing. Probably falling apart. You don't want to deal with that. Samuel felt something tighten, familiar now. We didn't say we did. Well, I'm just saying, it might be easier to sign it over. Taxes alone could bury you. We can handle it. Concern dressed up as practicality. Pressure disguised as help. Do you think kindness can be seen from a distance? The next day, a son called, asked questions he already knew the answers to, suggested options that all led in the same direction. Sign here. Let us take care of it. Don't complicate things. Eleanor listened quietly, thanked him for his worry, and hung up with steady hands. When she looked at Samuel, something had shifted. Not anger, resolve. They didn't argue. They didn't defend themselves. They packed instead. A small suitcase each, essentials only. The letter folded and placed carefully between a sweater and a photograph. As the bus station came into view days later, Eleanor felt something unfamiliar rise in her chest. Not hope exactly, but movement, forward motion after a long stillness. Would you have gone? The bus doors hissed open. Samuel offered his arm. She took it. They stepped inside without knowing what waited at the other end of the road, only that staying still had already taken too much from them. And as the engine rumbled to life, the question lingered, unanswered, but alive. Why them? The cabin smelled of pine, dust, and something faintly metallic, an odor that seemed out of place in the otherwise modest space. Eleanor ran a hand over the worn wooden table, noticing scratches that didn't match the age of the furniture, patterns that felt deliberate. Samuel crouched, tracing the uneven edges of the floorboards. One plank didn't sit flush, its grains subtly misaligned with the others. He pressed down, a soft click. The floorboard shifted. Eleanor gasped, hands flying to her mouth. What is it? A panel had been hidden in plain sight, its edges camouflaged by decades of careful design. Samuel knelt, sliding it aside to reveal a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Dust motes floated in the sunlight spilling through the cabin window, catching on the edges of something that smelled of old leather, paper, and money. With a flashlight borrowed from the cabin's small supply, they descended. What lay beneath was nothing short of astonishing. Rows of meticulously organized boxes, each labeled. Ancient paintings in protective cases leaned against walls. Ledgers bound in leather recorded transactions with dates, signatures, and notes in neat script spanning decades. Jewelry, coins, and legal documents rested together in precision, as though the space itself had been curated, not hidden. Eleanor opened a small notebook atop one crate. Her eyes widened as she read. A personal journal from Elias Rowan Hale. Every page chronicled his reasoning, his observations, his careful attention to who Thomas and Eleanor had become over the years. He hadn't just left them property. He'd studied their character, tested their integrity, and built this fortune for people he deemed worthy, not by blood, but by the lives they led. Samuel whispered, almost to himself. He saw everything, every choice, every sacrifice, and he trusted us anyway. Eleanor touched his arm. This isn't luck, Sam. This is recognition. They stood in silence, surrounded by the weight of decades and the precision of a life spent watching from afar. Can you imagine realizing someone saw your whole life? Do you think this was luck or recognition? What would you do standing here? The fortune beneath the cabin was more than wealth. It was validation, proof that integrity mattered, and that sometimes the quietest lives are the ones most deserving of reward. The tires crunched over the gravel driveway before anyone knocked. Samuel and Eleanor watched through the cabin window as 3 cars rolled to a stop. Out stepped their children, dressed sharply, faces composed, but eyes glinting with expectation. Behind them, a man in a tailored suit carried a briefcase stuffed with documents. Another clicked a camera, capturing the quiet tension like it was a spectacle. "Mom, Dad," their eldest said, voice soft but firm, "we just want to help. You can't manage this alone." Samuel's hands clenched. Eleanor stood behind him, eyes steady. "We've managed fine until now," she said, voice calm, measured. The children pressed harder. Guardianship papers, petitions, claims of incapacity, accusations of poor judgment. Media inquiries arrived as quickly as the lawyers. A photographer hovered at the cabin's edge. Every intrusion felt deliberate, every question a test of endurance. Samuel felt anger rise, but swallowed it. Eleanor laid a hand on his arm. "Breathe. They can't take our choice from us." Outside, Cedar Falls stirred. Dorothy from the library called first, voice trembling with protective fury. The diner owner offered deliveries to avoid unnecessary exposure. Sheriff Whitaker promised patrols. Slowly, a shield of quiet support formed around the couple. Neighbors, community members, and professionals who had witnessed the benefactor's careful planning. 3 weeks later, the courthouse smelled of polished wood and anxious anticipation. The judge, calm and deliberate, accepted documents from both sides. Gerald, the children's lawyer, argued concerns over incompetence, isolation, and influence. Robert, the couple's attorney, presented medical evaluations, testimony of independent living, and records of prior financial exploitation by their children. Then came the turning point. Judge Winters broke the seal on a decade-old envelope, handwritten by Elias Rowan Hale himself. She read aloud, pages describing his careful observation of Thomas and Eleanor, noting every act of integrity, every sacrifice, and every decision that proved their worthiness. He had anticipated the arrival of entitlement disguised as concern and had prepared accordingly. The courtroom held its breath. Rachel, Kyle, and Emma's claims crumbled silently under the weight of foresight and truth. Judgment was delivered. Guardianship denied. All legal fees paid by the petitioners. Any further harassment could trigger restraining orders and criminal charges. Calm, final, fair. Samuel exhaled. Eleanor's shoulders loosened. "What hurts more?" she whispered to him. "Greed or being misrepresented?" He shook his head slowly. Dignity speaks louder than shouting. In that quiet, victorious moment, they realized the fight hadn't been won by anger or retaliation, but by foresight, truth, and a community willing to honor what truly mattered. Victory doesn't feel like fireworks. It doesn't feel like applause. It feels heavy, settling in the chest like a stone after a long climb. Thomas and Margaret sat in the cabin, the fire casting flickering shadows across the timber walls. The courtroom was behind them, the legal battle over, the children's claims denied, but the silence that followed wasn't relief alone. It was grief. Grief for what their family had become, for the people they loved most, now strangers shaped by greed. Eleanor leaned her head against Thomas's shoulder. "We lost them a long time ago," she whispered, voice trembling but calm. "Not today, not now, years ago." He nodded, gripping her hand. "But we can choose what comes next, not from anger, not from revenge, from purpose." The next morning, the cabin felt different, not because the storm had passed outside, it hadn't, but because inside the air was cleared of tension, fear, and expectation. They called Patricia and Robert, gathering a small circle of trusted advisors who had fought beside them. Over the next weeks, Plans began to take shape, born from the understanding that what they'd inherited wasn't just wealth, it was responsibility. The Elias Brennan Foundation for Elder Justice became their vision, a place where lives shattered by betrayal could be rebuilt, where elderly men and women, abandoned by those they had trusted, could find shelter, legal guidance, and dignity. Rooms were filled not with trinkets or gold, but with hope. Thomas oversaw construction of tiny homes on the property, modest dwellings meant to provide independence while nurturing community. Margaret ran workshops and support groups, drawing from her own story of betrayal and survival. The first arrivals were quiet, wary, almost ghost-like. Helen, frail and exhausted, came carrying 2 trash bags of the few belongings she still owned after her daughter had sold her home without consent. Margaret hugged her before a word was spoken. "You're safe now," she said, her voice steady, carrying warmth that no money could buy. Over time, Helen found her own apartment, regained her confidence, and began volunteering at the foundation, offering the kind of care and attention she had once only dreamed of receiving. Each success was small but undeniable. One person healed, one life rebuilt, then another and another. The cabin and the surrounding land transformed into a place alive with laughter, with learning, and with purpose. Legal workshops taught others how to protect themselves. Counseling rooms offered safe spaces to grieve and rebuild. Tiny homes sheltered dozens who had nowhere else to go. Through it all, Thomas and Margaret remained grounded. They lived simply, never losing themselves to the fortune that had been entrusted to them. They sold pieces of the art collection selectively, ensuring each buyer respected the work's history and meaning, and every sale fed the foundation. They kept what they needed, comfortable but never indulgent. Every choice reflected Elias's trust in them and their determination to honor it. Even the fractures with their children remained. Michael, who had finally recognized the wrong in his actions, visited 2 years later. He came quietly, older, thinner, with a humility that hadn't existed before. No excuses, no demands, just acknowledgement. He listened, observed, and slowly, over hours, began to grasp the depth of what his parents had built. Thomas and Margaret offered him a seat at the table, but no forgiveness was rushed. Instead, they offered understanding, and for the first time, a glimmer of redemption. It was fragile, tentative, but real. Years passed. The foundation flourished. Hundreds found help. Legal frameworks were influenced, laws updated, and survivors empowered to protect themselves and their families. Every act of giving, every life restored, became a living testament to integrity. Thomas still worked with his hands, building homes and repairing cabins. Eleanor ran programs, counseled volunteers, and ensured the stories of survivors were honored and remembered. Together, they turned a fortune meant for consumption into a legacy of impact. And still, they returned often to the cabin porch. They watched the sun rise over the Montana mountains, listened to the wind sift through the pines, and reflected on the journey that had begun with betrayal and ended in quiet triumph. Margaret ran her hand across a photograph of Elias as a young man in front of this very cabin, remembering the quiet wisdom in his eyes. "He trusted us," she whispered, "and we honored him. And maybe we've begun to honor ourselves too." The foundation had become more than a project. It was proof that kindness, integrity, and courage could ripple outward. Lives healed, communities strengthened. The legacy of one man's faith in character multiplied exponentially. And Thomas and Margaret, ordinary people who had endured extraordinary betrayal, had become guardians of something far more valuable than money. The cabin, once a refuge from loneliness, now radiated purpose. The tiny homes stood firm, the foundation buildings thrummed with life, and the people who had once arrived with nothing left their hearts full. The Brennan name had become synonymous with hope, protection, and restoration. Margaret and Thomas stood together on the porch, their hands entwined. "We did what he hoped we would," said Thomas softly. "We did more," Margaret replied. "We gave others a chance to be safe, to be heard, to be rebuilt." They watched the sun dip behind the peaks, the sky painted in golds and roses. Around them, the foundation hummed quietly, filled with activity and purpose. They had turned a fortune into a movement, a gift into protection, and a second chance into thousands more. Even their children were a memory now, not of pain, but of lessons learned too late. Michael's presence reminded them that change was possible, though slow and earned. For Rachel, Kyle, and Emma, the opportunity had passed, leaving only echoes of the choices they had made. As darkness fell, the cabin glowed warmly. The fire burned, the wind moved through the trees, and Thomas and Margaret sat in the quiet, knowing they had honored what mattered most: integrity, generosity, and the courage to stand firm in a world that often rewarded the opposite. The final reflection lingered in Margaret's heart. Wealth isn't counted in dollars, nor possessions, nor titles. It's measured in lives touched, in dignity restored, and in the courage to use what you've been given for something bigger than yourself. They had $265 million, but what they truly inherited was the chance to prove that goodness still existed, and to give it away without hesitation. Years later, on a crisp October morning, the Elias Brennan Memorial Garden was dedicated on the foundation grounds. Paths wound through native plants, benches invited reflection, and a stone monument bore his words: "In a world of takers, remain givers. In a time of greed, maintain integrity. Build something that outlasts you." Hundreds attended, each a testament to the lives rebuilt, the futures restored, and the hope multiplied. Margaret stepped forward, voice steady, eyes clear. "5 years ago, we had nothing, betrayed, abandoned, forgotten. Then, a man we barely knew gave us everything. Not just money, but purpose. Not just property, but the chance to change lives. We chose to honor that gift, and this is what it looks like: lives restored, dignity returned, hope rebuilt." Thomas stood beside her, cutting the ribbon on the garden. The crowd applauded quietly but powerfully, each person touched by the weight of meaning over material. Margaret's gaze swept across the people they had helped, the tiny homes, the workshops, the survivors, all proof that what they built would last far longer than any fortune could. And as the sun set behind the Montana peaks, Thomas and Margaret walked back to the cabin hand in hand, knowing they had given not just wealth, but second chances, hope, and a legacy of care. Another emotionally linked story continues after this one. You will later send the end screen video. They called the widow crazy, but when it started snowing, she saved everyone. In this next story, viewers will witness how a single act of courage in the snow can change an entire community. The widow's decisions under impossible circumstances mirror the moral weight of giving and protecting, making it a natural follow-up. Audiences will feel suspense, emotion, and empowerment, compelling them to click to see how bravery intersects with human kindness. The story connects thematically to the Brennan Foundation narrative: hope, integrity, and lives saved, ensuring continuity of emotional investment. A must-watch narrative that promises tension, resolution, and heartwarming impact, leaving viewers inspired and deeply moved.